Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling a topic that's, well, a little mind-bending, to say the least. We're talking about the illusion of money. Yep, you heard that right. The money, the stuff we use every day. Well, it turns out that a whopping 90% of it isn't even real, like physical cash. It's just digital. And get this, we're talking trillions upon trillions of dollars just swirling around in the digital ether. And this whole thing isn't some far-out sci-fi scenario either. It's all thanks to a centuries-old banking trick. And you know what? It's led us straight to that eye-popping $34 trillion national debt we keep hearing about.
It's a pretty crazy concept when you really think about it, right?
Yeah, it's a lot to wrap your head around. So to guide us through this labyrinth of money and debt, we'll be pulling some fascinating insights from The Illusion of Money, Debt, Banking, and the Economy.
A great read, by the way.
Absolutely. So let's dive in. Where do we even begin to unravel this whole illusion of money thing?
Well, I think to really grasp how we got to this point, we need to take a trip back in time. Back to the very origins of money itself.
Okay, a history lesson. I'm in.
So picture this. A world before coins, before bills, before Venmo. You want a sack of grain? You gotta trade your goat for it. Need some tools, better have some livestock to barter with.
That's bartering, right?
Exactly. And you can imagine it wasn't the smoothest system.
Yeah, I can only imagine the arguments that must have broken out like, hey, my goat is worth at least 3 sacks of your grain.
You got it. It was all about negotiation and finding that sweet spot of perceived value.
So how did we ever move on from bartering? I mean, it sounds pretty chaotic.
Well, people naturally started looking for something a bit more, standardized, something that everyone could agree upon in terms of value.
Makes sense.
And that's where commodity money enters the picture.
Commodity money.
Think salt, cattle, even shells. These things held a relatively stable value and were a lot easier to trade than, an entire herd of sheep.
I guess that's progress. Although carrying around a sack of salt doesn't sound super convenient either.
It had its limitations for sure.
So when did we finally make the leap to something more practical, like the money we use today?
The real game changer came with the introduction of metal coins. Empires like ancient Rome used standardized gold and silver coins to grease the wheels of trade. These coins were durable, portable, and had a recognized value across vast distances.
So no more lugging around sacks of grain or herds of cattle.
Exactly. Talk about an upgrade.
So that's where coins and currency as we know them really took off.
You got it.
Fascinating. But hold on, did we just stick with coins forever? How did we end up with this whole digital money system?
Well, buckle up, because the next chapter of the story takes us to 17th century London and a group of pretty clever goldsmiths.
Goldsmiths? What do they have to do with money?
More than you might think. These goldsmiths, they started issuing paper receipts to merchants who deposited their gold with them for safekeeping. Think of it like a coat check for your gold.
Okay, so these receipts basically represented the gold that was stored away.
Precisely.
And I'm guessing people didn't want to lug around heavy gold all the time, so they started using these receipts instead.
You're catching on. It was way more convenient.
So they're trading these receipts as currency. That's pretty clever.
It was a simple idea that had a profound impact. And believe it or not, this seemingly small shift laid the foundation for the entire banking system we know today.
Wait, so you're telling me that our modern banking system is essentially built on a system of IOUs for gold that might not even exist anymore?
That's the illusion of money in a nutshell.
My mind is officially blown.
It's a lot to take in, for sure.
So these goldsmiths, they are onto something big, huh?
They were. This innovative idea of theirs led to the birth of what we now call fractional reserve banking.
Fractional reserve banking. Okay, that sounds a little intimidating.
It's not as complicated as it sounds.
Well, break it down for me then. What's so fractional about it?
So those clever goldsmiths, they started to realize that most people rarely came to redeem all of their gold at once.
Makes sense. I mean, why would you need all of it at the same time?
Right. So they figured, hey, why not lend out a portion of this gold while still keeping enough on hand to cover those receipts if someone comes knocking?
So they were lending out gold that didn't technically belong to them.
In a way, yes, but they found that as long as they kept a certain fraction of the gold in reserve, they could safely lend out the rest and even earn interest on those loans.
That sounds a little risky, but I guess it worked out for them.
It did, and this practice of lending out a fraction of deposits is the essence of fractional reserve banking.
So let me get this straight. By lending out a portion of the goldsmiths were essentially creating new money that went beyond the actual gold they had in their vaults.
You got it. That's the key insight here.
And this is where it gets really mind-blowing, right?
Exactly. Because this system, developed centuries ago, is still how banks create money today. But instead of gold, we now have digital entries.
Wait, so you're telling me that most of the money we use today isn't backed by physical gold or anything tangible. It's just ones and zeros in a computer system.
You got it. The illusion of money in all its glory.
Wow. This is a lot to process.
All right.
But fascinating stuff.
Absolutely.
So I guess we've just got to keep digging deeper into this rabbit hole.
Let's do it. And it's not just a historical curiosity. This is how our entire financial system operates today.
Right. It's not like we're still walking around with receipts for gold bars.
Not quite. But just like those goldsmiths lending out gold they didn't, fully own. Modern banks are doing the same thing. They're loaning out money that's basically created with a few keystrokes.
Okay, so how does this actually work in practice? Like, if I walk into a bank and ask for a mortgage, how are they just, creating money out of thin air?
Well, let's imagine you're buying a house and you need a $300,000 mortgage. The bank doesn't actually have a vault filled with $300,000 in cash just sitting there waiting for you. Instead, they create a digital entry for that amount. And poof, they deposit it into your account.
So just like that, brand new money enters the economy.
Exactly. Pretty wild, right?
It is. But if banks can just create money whenever someone asks for a loan, doesn't that mean they can create an unlimited amount?
Well, there are some limits, of course. Remember those goldsmiths and how they had to keep a fraction of the gold in reserve?
Right.
Well, modern banks have reserve requirements too. These are set by central banks, like the Federal Reserve here in the U.S. So let's say the reserve requirement is 10%. That means for your $300,000 mortgage, the bank needs to hold back $30,000 in reserve.
Got it. So they create the $300,000 but need to keep $30,000 of it on hand. What happens to the other $270,000?
That's where things get really interesting and where the money multiplier effect comes in.
The money multiplier. Okay, this sounds important.
It is. So that remaining $270,000, the bank can lend that out to other borrowers. And those borrowers, they'll spend that money.
Right, they'll buy things, go on vacation, the usual.
Exactly. And when they spend that money, it creates new deposits in other banks. And then those banks can lend out a portion of those new deposits, and so on and so on. It's a chain reaction of money creation.
So one loan leads to another, and it just keeps multiplying the original amount.
You got it. A single dollar can generate over $10 in new money through this multiplier effect. It's a pretty powerful system, and it's a big part of how our economy has grown so rapidly.
Okay, that is mind-boggling. But it also sounds a little too good to be true. I mean, there have got to be some downsides to creating so much money this way, right?
You're right to be cautious. There are definitely risks involved. And that's where really understanding the illusion of money becomes so crucial. When we rely so heavily on this debt-fueled money creation, it can lead to some serious consequences, like inflation, for instance.
Oh, yeah, inflation. The word on everyone's lips these days. It seems like prices are going up on everything.
It's true, and it's a complex issue, but this money creation system is definitely part of the picture.
So how exactly does money creation tie into inflation?
Well, think about it this way. When the supply of money is growing faster than the supply of actual goods and services, it creates an imbalance. Too much money chasing too few goods. And what happens then? Prices go up.
It's like everyone suddenly has more money to spend, but there's not enough stuff to buy, so the prices get bid up.
Exactly. It's a classic supply and demand situation.
Okay, that makes sense. So inflation's one risk. What else should we be worried about?
Well, another major risk is the formation of asset bubbles.
Asset bubbles. I've heard that term, but I'm not sure I fully understand it.
It's basically when all that cheap, easily created money floods into assets, like stocks, real estate, or even things like cryptocurrencies.
So instead of being used for productive things, the money just goes into inflating the prices of these assets.
You got it. And the problem is, those inflated prices might not actually reflect the true value of those assets.
Right, it's like a house of cards waiting to collapse.
Exactly. And when those bubbles eventually burst, it can lead to financial instability and economic downturns, like the housing crisis we saw back in 2008.
Oh, right, that was a mess.
It was. And there's another looming risk we need to talk about: the debt trap.
Okay, debt trap sounds pretty ominous.
It is. It refers to the situation where individuals, corporations, even entire governments become burdened by unsustainable levels of debt. Remember, all that money created through loans, it needs to be repaid with interest. And when those debt levels become too high, it can trigger a whole cascade of financial problems.
So it's like we're on a treadmill that keeps getting faster and faster, and we can't keep up with the payments.
That's a good analogy. Right now, U.S. household debt alone is over $17 trillion.
Wow, that's a lot of debt.
It is, and globally, total debt has reached over $300 trillion. That's more than 3 times the world's annual economic output.
Those are some seriously scary numbers.
They are, and it raises some big questions about the long-term health of our economy and the risks we've been talking about. Inflation, asset bubbles, the debt trap, they all become magnified when we're dealing with such enormous sums of money.
Okay, I'm officially feeling a little overwhelmed. This all feels a bit like, I don't know, a runaway train heading for a cliff.
I understand the feeling. It can be pretty daunting to think about all of this.
So is there any way to escape this cycle of debt and potential financial meltdown?
Well, the good news is that we're not powerless. Understanding how this system works is the first step towards finding solutions.
Okay, that's a little reassuring.
And believe it or not, even governments are in on this money creation game.
Wait, governments create money too?
They don't create it in the same way banks do, but their spending habits have a huge impact on the amount of money circulating in the economy. In many countries, governments routinely spend more than they collect in taxes. It's called deficit spending.
So they're basically living beyond their means, just like some people do with credit cards.
You could say that. And to cover those deficits, governments issue bonds.
Bonds, right. Those are like investments that people buy.
Exactly. Government bonds are essentially IOUs. They promise to repay the borrowed money with interest at a future date.
So if I buy a bond, I'm essentially lending money to the government.
That's the basic idea. And these bonds are bought by individuals, pension funds, and, very importantly, the Federal Reserve.
Ah, the Federal Reserve. The big kahuna of the financial world. What's their role in all of this?
Well, the Fed's involvement is where things get extra fascinating. They have a unique power. They can create new money digitally, essentially out of thin air, to buy those government bonds.
Wait, they can just create money like that, just like banks do with the fractional reserve system.
It's similar, but on a much, much larger scale. It's called quantitative easing, or QE for short. And it's been used extensively by central banks around the world, especially since the 2008 financial crisis.
The Fed is basically printing digital money and using it to buy up government debt. I mean, it sounds like a pretty sweet deal for the government.
It can be, but there's a catch, of course. This influx of new money can further fuel inflation, it can exacerbate those asset bubbles we talked about, and it can contribute to that growing mountain of government debt.
Right. It's not all sunshine and roses then.
Definitely not. And speaking of government debt, did you know that the current U.S. national debt exceeds $34 trillion?
$34 trillion. That's more money than I can even wrap my head around.
It's a staggering number.
And what are the implications of a debt that massive?
Well, for one thing, it means the government has to keep issuing new bonds to pay off the old ones, plus all that accumulating interest.
So we're basically stuck in a system where we need to keep creating more and more debt just to keep things afloat.
It's a cycle that can be very difficult to break free from.
So where do we go from here? Is there any hope for breaking out of this cycle of debt and instability?
There is, and that's exactly what we'll explore when we come back.
All right, we're back. And I've got to say, after that deep dive into the world of debt and money creation, I'm feeling a little, well, overwhelmed. Is there any light at the end of this tunnel?
There is. There is. It's easy to get caught up in all the doom and gloom. But it's important to remember that this system, for all its flaws, is a human creation. And that means we have the power to change it.
Okay, that's a little reassuring. But where do we even begin? We're talking about trillions of dollars of debt and a system that's been in place for centuries.
You're right. It's a daunting challenge. But there are some innovative ideas out there, some radical, some more practical, that could help us create a more sustainable and equitable financial system.
Okay, I'm all ears. Let's hear about some of these potential solutions.
Well, one approach focuses on shifting our priorities, from funding speculation to funding actual productivity. Right now, a lot of money creation goes towards inflating asset prices, which doesn't really benefit the real economy.
So instead of pumping up the stock market or the housing market, we should be investing in things that actually create real value.
Exactly. Imagine if we channeled more money into renewable energy infrastructure, education, healthcare, small businesses, things that create jobs, produce goods and services, and genuinely benefit society.
That makes a lot of sense. So what other ideas are out there?
Another intriguing concept is the idea of debt jubilees. It might sound radical, but it's actually rooted in ancient practices where debts were periodically forgiven to prevent economic collapse and social unrest.
Wait, so you're suggesting we just wipe out a bunch of debt? Wouldn't that cause chaos in the financial system?
It would require careful planning and implementation, of course, but targeted debt forgiveness could provide significant relief to individuals, and it could even jumpstart economic activity.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this could work. What about student loan debt, for example? Millions of people are struggling under the weight of those loans.
Exactly. A debt jubilee could target specific types of debt that are holding people back, like student loans or medical debt, freeing up their income and allowing them to contribute more to the economy. It sounds like a bold move, but it could have a powerful ripple effect. Any other radical ideas we should be considering?
Well, how about this central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs for short?
CBDCs. I've heard that term thrown around, but honestly, I have no idea what it means.
Think of it as digital cash issued directly by central banks like the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
It would bypass the traditional banking system entirely.
Wow, that is radical. But why would we want to do that? What are the potential benefits?
For starters, it could offer greater transparency and control over money creation. It could also enable governments to fund public projects without incurring more debt. And it could even allow for more targeted and efficient distribution of things like stimulus payments.
Sounds like it could be a game changer, but I imagine there's potential downsides too.
There are definitely concerns that need to be addressed, like privacy and security, but it's a conversation we need to be having.
Yeah.
As we explore ways to create a more stable and equitable financial system.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this deep dive, there's one final question I keep coming back to. We've talked about all these potential solutions, shifting to productivity, debt jubilees, CBDCs, but they all seem to require a pretty massive shift in thinking, both on a personal and societal level.
You're absolutely right. It's not enough to simply understand the mechanics of money creation. We need to have a broader conversation about the values and goals we want our financial system to reflect.
So it's about more than just numbers and policies. It's about rethinking our relationship with money and how it shapes our lives and our world.
Precisely. Do we continue down a path of ever-increasing debt and financial instability, or do we choose a different path, one that prioritizes human well-being, social justice, and environmental sustainability?
Those are big questions, and they don't have easy answers. But one thing is clear, we need to be having these conversations.
Absolutely. The future of our economy and ultimately our planet depends on it.
Well, listeners, this has been quite a journey. We've traveled from the origins of money to the complexities of modern banking and the mind-boggling world of debt and money creation.
We've explored the risks involved in this system, but also the potential solutions that could lead us toward a more sustainable and equitable future.
It's a lot to process, but we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and empowered you to think critically about the role of money in our lives.
Remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand how these systems work, the better equipped we are to make informed decisions and advocate for change.
And on that note, it's time to wrap up this deep dive into the illusion of money. Keep those minds curious and keep those questions coming. Until next time.